Okay, we'll get started. So welcome everyone to this webinar from Cambridge Centre for Evaluation and Monitoring, which is all about the Cambridge Wellbeing Check. I'll just start with a few housekeeping points for the session. So to ensure good sound quality, all members of the audience are muted. If you would like to ask a question, please post them in the questions section located to the right-hand side of your screen. You can post questions throughout the webinar and we will look at them either as we go or at the end of the session. You will receive a certificate of attendance sent to your email inbox 1 hour after the webinar finishes, and you will receive a copy of the webinar recording sent via email next week. We'd love to know where you're joining us from today, so please feel free to use the chat box to introduce yourself. We'd also like to know whether you're using a wellbeing check already for your students in your school, and if so, which one you're using and anything you can tell us about that. So before I hand over to Mark, I'll just say a few words to introduce Cambridge Chem, which is the Centre for Evaluation and Monitoring. So we've been working with schools for 40 years in over 100 countries. We're known for our evidence-based research approach to baseline and formative assessments, using extensive data sets to support future outcomes and development. We work with schools, ministries and associations to transform the outcomes of the students they teach. In 2019, we became part of the University of Cambridge, which has supported our reach and abilities to support young people across the world. We help teachers turn data into knowledge, we bridge the gap between research and practice, and we provide evidence to support good decision making. I'll now hand over to our presenter, Mark Fraser, who is our teaching and learning lead, to find out more about the Cambridge Wellbeing Check.
Thanks, Cora, and welcome to you all, wherever you're joining us from today, whatever the time of day it is where you are. And just a little bit about myself before we start. As Cora mentioned, I'm teaching and learning lead at the CEM, and we have here a lot of experience in working with schools and working with teachers to support in a whole variety of things, and that's my background. I came from the world of primary schools. I was a head teacher for 10 years and taught in 3 schools across the northeast of England. I joined Chem in 2015, and my area of interest is trying to take academic information, evidence-based information, and present it to teachers in an easily accessible and understandable way. So this morning, or this afternoon, or this evening, wherever you are, what we're going to be talking about is well-being. And we're just going to think about what well-being is quite generally, and why it's important, specifically in the context of learning, why we should assess well-being, and then we'll tell you a little bit about the Cambridge Wellbeing Check and the reports that come from it, and we can talk about that quite generally. You may be using other systems, and we're just going to think about what you can do with that information in that sort of final step there, so you can take your information and what can you do to improve well-being in your school. So as Cora mentioned, it would be really interesting to for you to join in the chat, get some comments going there, and we'll do a bit of a double act between Cora and myself. She'll look at some of the questions and maybe be able to provide answers by typing in, or we might choose to have a chat about them. It would be interesting to know, as we said, where you are. Are you using any kind of well-being system? Do you have a well-established policy in your school or college? Anything of interest and relevance would be really interested to know. So moving on, the first slide here is a clip from an OECD report. And again, when I first sort of started looking for slides for this sort of popped up. I remembered this briefly from 2020, and it's very, very strange to kind of revisit it 3 years on. March 2020, March 23, where we are now. And this was a very sort of optimistic and positive report. It says good news. That your well-being has, in some respects, improved relative to the decade before. 2010, when we were feeling sort of the impact of that financial crisis of that era, and people were feeling quite good about things. However, there was a kind of a message which really sort of rings true today about, looking forward, there's no room for complacency. Storm clouds may be gathering on the horizon here. They were thinking about environmental and social challenges. I don't think anybody saw, the change that was coming with the COVID pandemic, deepening environmental worries, war on, certain parts of the world that have never seen that kind of thing for, decades and decades. The cost of living crisis, fuel poverty, all of these kind of things that are affecting, the global community. Whatever next? And I think adults and young people alike are arguably sort of far more anxious about daily life than they were just 2 or 3 years ago. But if one good thing's come from the recent past, it's perhaps that the importance of personal well-being is far more prominent now than it ever has been. But what do we mean by well-being? And specifically in the context of school or college or education settings more generally. In the UK, we've seen this report, which is quite interesting in the last couple of years, about the experience of young people across the United Kingdom. And it takes its data from what's called the British Household Survey, and the last wave was 2019, 2020, and there were some interesting results even then. So as you can see, I've got three. There's a lot of data in that report, but I've just selected 3 graphs from it. And how are young people feeling? And the first one on the left there, family. They're bouncing along a bit, but it's generally consistent. People are generally happy about their sort of home settings. You've got some quite positive scores there. But if you look at the other two, life as a whole and school, they surely show a downward trend there. There is something quite sort of worrying taking place there. Why has satisfaction about life as a whole, which seems to be fairly sort of evenly dipping down there. School, a little bit more erratic, we're bouncing around a bit more there. However, very clearly a downward trend. What on earth is going on? So some good news, children feel secure in the home, but generally in life and in school in particular, maybe we need to be thinking about this a little bit more carefully. So our work that we've been doing over the last 2 or 3 years has related to this report, which was produced in 2015 and was written by Ros McClellan and Susan Stewart, who are from the Faculty of Education in Cambridge. So this is the original research which kicked off our wellbeing work. Their research highlights the need to think about or distinguish between wellbeing measures for adults and children. You see a lot of surveys out there, a lot of reports. Very few of them, even things that are specific to children and young people, quite often only have school. Maybe, like I'm thinking about one that I saw not long ago, and there were 10 things, and the 9th thing on that list was school. And we think that our work has focused far more closely on the sort of the educational experiences in school, college settings. So we see well-being as having sort of 2 main overarching sort of functions. Well, we've got functioning, but also we've got feelings. So 2 strands. And then we subdivide those 2 strands into life satisfaction, how much students, feel sort of this contentment with life, and how, generally how happy they are to be alive. Negative emotions, what's their sort of tendency to sort of dwell on negative thoughts? Do they feel anxious? Do they feel stressed and sad? They're the sort of the drains, that sort of pull you down. So what impact maybe, feeling such, negative thoughts, what does that have on the functioning of a student as well? And how might it interfere with kind of interpersonal well-being, your sort of relationships with others, and also your competence, basically how sort of well equipped do you feel to deal with sort of the challenges of the educational world, but also thinking further down the line, how well equipped are our children and young people to deal with the real world after school and after college. So we're going to think a little bit more about those 4 areas, and just some sort of caveats to that. We know that well-being is a subjective psychological state, so that means it changes over time. it changes according to the context. And interestingly, children in very, very similar situations can experience very different levels of well-being. So those material and physical conditions that exist around children, those circumstances can be almost identical, but one child might feel a lot happier than another, despite their similarities. So how on earth do we kind of identify which children we need to focus on? Well, we must ask them, we think, in a sensitive and confidential and caring and supportive way. So we'll come back to that in a little while. But just before we do, just think about well-being in this context of schools and why it's important. In a nutshell, we think it's essential to academic success. Unsurprisingly, we think better well-being is linked with motivation. You know, the better you feel, the more positive you are, the more highly motivated you are. That's nothing new. I don't think that's going to surprise anybody. You know, students who want to learn will make better progress. They'll be putting the effort in. But we know, I'm thinking back to my time in school, one of the key metrics I was always judged by was attendance, school attendance. And you had various targets to make sure that students were there. And students who are well motivated attend school. On the other side of that coin, students who aren't well motivated are far more likely to truant. That's to skip school, to go missing, if you like. If they're not in school, they're not learning, we think. Now, we've had some interesting research, within Cambridge just recently. Particularly a paper from last year, which presented at a conference in Mexico by Renka Suto and Tom Benton. They looked at various research documents that were out there already and picked out some interesting things. And they looked at a couple of papers here, which we mentioned. We've got some references at the end if you'd like to follow these up. And a couple of researchers here in particular identified, a relationship between well-being and educational performance. As I said, not so much of a surprise that. However, what is interesting to me as a school leader is this next point, and that's from Lindorf in 2020, who concluded that there is definite evidence of well-being and attainment, but also, and this is where the subtle difference exists, I think, between how you in your school are implementing your policies. How consistent are they? How sort of well thought out are they? That as an organization is the key here. You need to be, have your finger on the pulse in terms of what's going on in your school. We'll come back to that when we talk about the well-being check. But also you need to have that sort of framework, that policy framework, the procedures in place in order to make it work and make it work consistently and in a fairly sort of egalitarian way for everybody. So a very, very general question here. Why should we assess well-being in schools? Well, why should we assess anything, I suppose? And we're from an assessment organization, Cambridge University Press and Assessment. We've been doing tests and exams for years, and what's the point of it? Why are we doing it? There's different types of assessment, as we know, and I'm using the word assessment here in a very kind of low stakes, formative information gathering kind of a way. So we are not judging anybody here. This is just about obtaining better information, because if you've got that better level of information, well, you understand you improve your understanding of any particular situation that you're looking at. So that's true of well-being as it is of children's attainment in maths, or their progress in geography or history or art, or PE, whatever it is. You need to be gathering information, and that can be done by observing what's going on. Through individual conversations you have with your pupils and your students, what their general feeling is. As class teachers, you're in a very sort of unique position, aren't you? You're quite often in contact with the young people for far longer than any other professionals ever are, hugely more time spent in the classroom than a child would ever spend visiting, I don't know, a doctor or, another sort of professional. They just have a very, very short glimpse of children's lives, but you as teachers and school leaders see far more of it. So it's about gathering information, nothing for no other reason than just improving your understanding of the situation. Again, just dotting back to this report that I mentioned a few minutes ago, there's a really nice quote here about, there's an acknowledgement of the importance of, children's well-being. I think that goes without saying, but we need to ask children themselves about their well-being rather than relying on us as adults kind of guessing or inferring what's going on from the comments and the observations we make. So that's really important. So I'm just going to pause here and see, has anybody, Cora, I wonder, mentioned anything about using a well-being check and what they maybe do with it? Because I'm just about to talk about that in a moment. I don't know, can you see anything there?
We haven't had any details so far, but we do have one member of the audience today is a school psychologist. So I'm wondering if that's something that some schools have in place, where they have a onboard psychologist or counsellor, and it might be useful for them to know how they can use the wellbeing check and what that might do for them.
Absolutely, that's interesting. I mean, that's quite a facility to have. I mean, I would have been very, very keen to have a psychologist. I had an educational psychologist attached to our school, but we only had them for a very limited period of time across a term. But that's great. Well, if you've got a psychologist in school or not, again, it's all about pulling that evidence together and then thinking about what you would do with it. And I think there's four key things here, I think, which you would use your information for, and that's to just teach and explore well-being with students. Do they actually know what it is? Do they know what we mean when we say well-being, especially the younger children? Because the Cambridge Wellbeing Check is suitable for use with very young children up to children, well, young adults really, and can all of our learners actually articulate and describe what well-being is and what it means to them? So I think it's a useful tool to look at that first objective there. But if you're using it from a monitoring point of view, I think you can use it to understand individual students' well-being levels. It's in the green box there. On a one-to-one basis, you might want to think about well-being, but also you need to think about the broader picture and evaluate the well-being of groups of students across your whole school or college, or maybe you're part of a chain, an organization, a multi-academy trust, or all of these other organizations where schools are grouped together. And once you've done that evaluation, you're going to kind of want to put some interventions or some measures in place, and then let it run the cycle and come back to it and evaluate the impact. What have you actually achieved here? What's changed? Has anything changed? So this is this evaluate the impact. Something might have changed, brilliant. Then you might want to keep doing more of that. On the other side of the coin, it might not have worked at all. And you might think, oh my goodness, right, we need to think again. So what else can we try? That didn't work. What else might work? But unless you are using some kind of instrument, some kind of tool, some kind of survey to do this, you're going to kind of struggle to monitor that kind of the change that's taking place, I think. Is there something
Yeah,
there, Cora?
That's very interesting, because we've had someone here say they're not sure that what they do counts, or perhaps they're not sure how they can get a clear measurement of that. So, hopefully this session will be able to take them through that.
All right, great. Well, we shall tell you a little bit more about ours, but again, there are plenty of other wellbeing checks out there as well that people will be using. So we hope there's some generalities for everybody here, but that's great. That's an interesting point. So let's have a look. Let's just move on and see our next slide. So the wellbeing check itself is a very simple system. It's a digital system. It runs on any PC, tablet, or laptop. There is no paperwork or marking. It's all electronically done, quick and easy to set up. It's a very simple, as I said, survey is what it is. You've got 22 questions that your students respond to. You can use it any time. You can use it as many times throughout the year as you like. It's as granular as you want the information to be. And it's based, all of the questions come from that research paper that I showed you at the start, the McClellan and Stewart paper. And they are very, very simple questions. So if you are making your own, kind of assessments, we would suggest you keep the language, the carrier language, very, very simple. This is not meant to be a test of literacy or the understanding of English language or anything like that. And we know there are some students out there who have problems accessing language for a variety of reasons. It might not be their first language, or they may have, a barrier to learning of some kind of need that is preventing them, reading and understanding this. So we've kept the language very, very simple. And that's the same set of questions for the youngest right up to the oldest users of this system. And again, the responses are quite simple as well. It's just this same scale, never often, sometimes, often, and always. And we've also thrown a couple of kind of safety checks into this as well, in terms of, you can see a question, when I'm at school, I feel happy. But also, we've got another question which comes shortly afterwards. When I am at school, I feel sad. And again, this is a little bit of a safety net in terms of because we do not interpret the data from this. We present the data back to schools, and then it's up to you, the users, to kind of interpret it and make inferences from it. And if you see, so Mark does this survey, and you notice that he is always happy, but always sad. I'd be thinking, I think Mark's just kind of skipped through that and hasn't really paid attention to it, which in itself is a sign of, he hasn't taken this seriously, maybe he's distracted, maybe he just doesn't understand what's going on here. Whatever it is, it's a cue for a conversation. And if you see any data like this, whether it's, as I say, in well-being, or it could be in geography, it could be in art, it could be in maths, if you see surprising contradictions, well, you might not get the answer directly from the assessment itself, but it's an area for further investigation as a teacher, or as if you're looking at this across a school and you see something quite unusual, it's something to go and look at. So very simple examples there, and they have a scale, where it just runs up and down. So I've got a positive scale with some of the questions are positively phrased, and sometimes they are negatively phrased questions. So the scale runs in the opposite direction, and the reporting engine makes sense of that. And we have lots of reports. Once the slides come to you, you can see them up close. So I don't pretend for 1 minute you can read the small print on some of these, because it is fairly tiny, but I'll just, you can see the general shape. I'm just going to show you a couple of examples. Again, we'd love it if you wanted to talk about using our system, but if you've got your own system, or you're thinking of developing one, here's a few ideas as to what you might want to do. One report might just be a really obvious, here are the questions we asked, here are the responses an individual student gave. And we're just doing this by having a grid with ticks in. We highlight in color the areas where there might be an issue. So you can see there's a red tick here where this particular student, Isaac, has said that he never feels confident. And that's a bit unfortunate. So we want to know more about that. So we're just using subtle color to sort of just draw your attention to the fact that that's something that you might want to kind of dig a little bit deeper into. We present information like this. This is sometimes some people prefer that kind of quantitative view where you can see the average responses for each section. So this isn't an individual question level report, but we've split this according to the 4 bands. You've got the competence, well-being, interpersonal well-being, life satisfaction, negative emotions. And as you can see, the first 3, Martin is feeling pretty positive about things, but negative emotions here really stands out. There's something going on there. Why is he dwelling on those negative thoughts, negative feelings so frequently? I mean, this is just made up data, but you get the idea that, if there is an anomaly, then that's where you would start digging. That's what you would want to know more about. So this is just highlighting areas. This is not a clinical instrument, but this is just shining a spotlight on an area that you can go and look at in greater detail using the evidence that you have in school. We also have like a a qualitative view where we have little comments that we feed back to students. This is sometimes nice. Taking the numbers out of a situation sometimes makes it feel less threatening and less challenging, and this is, we think, a little bit more sort of friendly to students, particularly if there were issues that you wanted to deal with in a very sensitive way. And I mean, really, we can't kind of boil people's feelings down to a particular number. The numbers give us a general feeling of what might be going on, but we need to be very cautious about overinterpreting data, and this is a nice way of doing that. Again, if you want to interpret data, if you're looking particularly at average responses across the school to particularly uncover areas within the 4 strands or specific areas, specific questions, you can look at this and see, are there some themes emerging here? Because individuals might have a particular experience, but pushed together into one cohort, there may be some themes that emerge. And again, that's the sort of thing you can be looking at with these reports. Again, there's lots of them at the end for you to kind of have a browse through. You can drill down into the different responses. Here's another one where we use color. So we've got, I feel good about myself, I feel healthy. We've generally got positive responses there. However, I feel I'm doing well, and we've got a red block has appeared here. So we've got 20% of our students who are feeling, I'm not always convinced I'm doing very well. So again, why is that? What would you want to do, in order to address that? Again, everybody's circumstances will be entirely different. There will be no fixed answer, but you can maybe deal with this as a staff and think about what can we do to improve our children's and students' confidence. Why don't we ask them directly? This would be a great way of sort of running a session in a kind of citizenship PHSCE kind of session. You've got, I don't know, assemblies, workshops, all of these things that you could do to sort of uncover in a little bit more detail what students are thinking and feeling. That's a table, again, tiny writing. I don't pretend you can read it, but this comes as a part of our resources, and it's just like a little table which shows you what the report contains and which kind of situation you might wish to use it in. Lesson plans. So we provide lesson plans. However, I'm sure that you need these, whatever you're doing in school, you might be accessing other sources of information, which I'll come to in a minute. Where else can you find out things like this if it wasn't from Cambridge? There's some really nice websites out there that you can go and look at. But we have a very, broad range of lesson plans, and they're quite lengthy documents. They're about 30 pages each, but not everybody wants to use them as a script. So use it as a script if you want, but teachers are we had a phrase when I was in the classroom, we like to cherry pick, or some people called it magpieing, picking out the shiny bits. And you take what you want and you build it into your lesson as, as you see appropriate. We've got some nice comments coming into the chat here as well. I can see Cora's just showing me here that we've got people agreeing that they teach similar topics on well-being, which include feelings, mental health, wellness, and all the way through. Wow, that's a range. I'm not sure who wrote that. Where we've got from KG, from very young children up to year 9, and this is an interesting comment here. This is from, I hope you don't mind me just picking out your name. Lucy, never thought about carrying out a well-being check and just thinking you can be developing a survey that monitors the students' well-being. Absolutely. I would suggest you go and have a look at that paper that we've got there from, the well-being research that we built this work on, and just have a look at the questions they're asking, and just hopefully some of the hints and tips I'm giving you might help. Again, it's just about asking children about what they feel. And I'm going to kind of touch on this in a little while, but sometimes you need to be a little bit crafty here, and even something as informal and as as accessible as a well-being survey. Children and young people quite often give the answers that they think we want to hear, and there are other ways of sort of gathering information as well, which I'll come to when we think about the lesson plans well, actually, I'll talk about it. And actually, since I've got the lesson plan thing on the screen here, there are some really nice little activities in there where you can do some sticky note kind of activities where you're just writing on how are we feeling today, what's worrying us, and doing it as a group or as individuals, and having them maybe just kept secret, or or shared with our sort of fellow students. But when you're doing something informally, it's quite often when children and young people are at their most comfortable, and they will be maybe happy to kind of disclose things in that situation that they wouldn't. I always loved doing yard duty when I was in school. Even as a head teacher, I went out there every lunchtime if I could, if I was in school, just because I felt it kind of helped, moderate the behavior sometimes when children are getting a bit more boisterous. But also in that informal situation, children just roamed up fairly randomly and told me the most interesting things that I would never have known if you were sitting in a maths lesson teaching them. So there's that informality, I think, as well. So double-pronged attack here. I think you need the system, you need a well-being check of some sort, but you've got to have that soft information gathering process going on all the time. And again, the lesson plans give you some nice ideas for doing that. If you used our Chem system here, we've got various ways of getting support as well, the guidance that we provide, the online support, or you can actually ring up and speak to somebody. So this is, I suppose, the interesting thing. What can we do to improve well-being in schools? This is like the so what kind of part of the presentation. We've got some information. What are we going to do with it? If you're starting from scratch, or if you are thinking about reformatting, representing your policies, in the UK, some of this is UK centric, but anybody can access this information. This is a really interesting document, which is a few years old now. I think this was maybe first published in about 2015, and it's free to go to on the .gov.uk website there. And anybody who is familiar with the UK government website, particularly the education section, will know that there are thousands of documents, and they keep getting kind of piled on top of each other. And a document from a few years ago is quite tricky to find. So you can find this either by just going onto that site and searching for that title there, promoting children and young people's mental health and well-being, or clicking on the link when you get the slides. And it's got some interesting background information to start with about the decline in mental health, if you like, how it's becoming more prevalent within our population. And this was produced, pre-pandemic, and I'm fairly sure, things have changed more dramatically in the last 3 years. But if you're thinking about a school policy, this is a really nice way of addressing it, because it's got a nice 8-stage model in. And again, whether you have a system in place or whether you don't, this is a good way of either thinking about setting one up or reviewing what you already do. So I'll explain a little bit more about the red rings in a moment, but you can see the different strands of it there. And right in the middle of it, you can see leadership and management. And remember the document that we looked at earlier on from Suto and Benton talked about the importance of having a whole school approach being consistent, and that's where school leaders and managers come in. They've got to provide the support and be the champions to promote emotional health and well-being. If you are not doing a well-being check of any kind, I think you might struggle to do the things that I've circled in red. You need to have that source of information to tell you what you should be teaching, really. What are the problems that you need to address? Now, this will change and vary massively across the globe. The social issues children face in the UK will be very, very different from social issues in other parts of the world. So again, there's no sort of strict rule here. This is highly dependent on your particular setting. But also, the second one there, moving around clockwise around the circle here, we've got, enabling the student voice to influence decisions. If we're not asking the students what they feel and what they think, how are we enabling that student voice? you might have another way of doing that, but a survey, a people survey, a student survey, a well-being check, whatever you're using, that's really key to enabling that student voice. Actually, I should probably have a ring around staff development as well, because unless you know what the issues are, what on earth are teachers and leaders going to do about that? So you need to know what the key problems are. And then, as mentioned earlier on in the presentation, once you've done your well-being check, once you've found out what the issues may be, you will do something about it, and then you need to work out how effective your actions have been. So that's that monitoring of the impact. So that's running another survey. Whether you do that after a term, after 2 terms, after a year, however you do it, you just need to have a baseline, what we would say a baseline, which is that your first assessment. This is what you did the first time round. You put the intervention in place, and then you come back with the survey again, and you see how things have changed. Nothing complicated about that. It's like measuring a child's growth, isn't it? You put a mark on the wall. I'm sure I did this with my daughter. I used to have a little, on one of the door frames, put a little pencil mark, and then a few weeks later, growing slightly, and so on. And you have this kind of ongoing monitoring. You're seeing how things are changing, how children are growing, not just physically, but in terms of their well-being as well. So where can you go to find out more information? This is one of my favorite websites for well-being. Now, we are not directly connected with Anna Freud, but it's interesting. I've been to a couple of conferences where other people have picked this out, and I really like this. Again, UK-based, but open to everybody to go and look at. And they have a really nice framework here where you can, again, think about what you are doing to support well-being in your setting. So leading change, working together, understanding the need. That's where the well-being check comes in. What are the problems? What are the issues? What do we need to think about? And then 4, how do we promote it? 5, I'm not really talking about today, but as school leaders, you need to be thinking about this as well. And this is the topic for another discussion. I think supporting staff. All the things I've been talking about really are about checking on young people's well-being, but do not forget, or do not overlook the fact that if your staff are not feeling good, you're going to have problems as well. So it's about looking after everybody in the community, and there's some nice bits of advice and guidance here. And I mean, there's an example that's not just within the UK, but specific to Scotland. Again, I've picked this out for anybody to go and look at because they have some really nice kind of contextual information, but they talk about how they're going to deal with it within their curriculum. So just showing that as a nice example. And then as we sort of come to the end of the session here, I think there's always just one very simple thing teachers can do. And that's just to make sure that every student has formed at least one strong and supportive professional appropriate relationship with an adult in school. It's always the case that students and young people who move from school to school on a regular basis always feel maybe a little bit like the odd one out. They haven't built up those relationships with their peers or with the staff over time. So I think you need to be particularly mindful of that and look out for those new joiners to your school and setting, and just make sure that they're linked up with somebody. Everybody needs somebody to talk to when the going gets tough, whether they are children, young people, adults. We all need somebody there. And as somebody used to tell me when I first started teaching, it's the quiet ones to watch out for. It's the shy little person at the back corner there who might never say anything, but they're the ones we need to really make sure that they're all right. They're probably not confident to come and talk to you. So how do we do that? So we do it in a range of informal, supportive, and caring ways. So I think that's the end of the slides, and thanks very, very much for listening. It's been great to talk to you today. And maybe just before we wrap up, Cora might want to come back on and see, have we got any questions or queries, or is there anything you would like to type into the chat now, and we'll do our very best to answer them now. If we can't get you an answer now, we'll get back to you very shortly.
Great, thank you so much for that presentation, Mark. That was really interesting. So as you say, we've got some time left in the session to answer any questions. So if there's anything you'd like us to go over or anything further you'd like to know or to ask Mark or myself, please do pop it in the question box, and we've got some time now to go through them. I'll just see if we've had any come in. So we've got a question here about wellbeing in early years. So someone is asking about if this tool will be useful for younger students, say age 3 to 5, especially the questions about competence wellbeing. I know the wellbeing tool is designed and aimed at children from 7 up, but do you have any thoughts on introducing wellbeing in the early years curriculum and how to approach that?
Yeah, hand on heart, I would say that the wellbeing check as presented is going to be tricky to use with the very young children. However, you might want to have a look at the background research here and see the kinds of questions we are asking. As I said at the beginning, they're really, really simple. So just, when you're in school, do you feel happy? When how well do you get on with the other children? You could be asking for the sort of the views and the opinions of very young children. But again, in my view, I think quite often the younger the child, the more inclined they are to give you the answer that they think you want. So this is where I think observation in the early years is particularly important. I think as teachers, how children tend to interact with each other, how they should be interacting with each other at this stage, who needs support, who needs to be shown how to share. I mean, going back to again, I think the world's moved on a lot in the sort of 25-ish years, I think, since I qualified as a teacher. And I think my first boss, who's a wonderful lady who just lives up the road from where I'm sitting now, actually in northeast England here, and she basically said all she wanted at the end of reception class was that children were able to share nicely and get on with each other. And I think it's just such a lovely thought that it's those basic interpersonal skills that you kind of need to get a grip of. We need to be very careful about over-interpreting what young children say and, just asking them reasonably complex questions. But I would say, certainly in the early years, observation would be the way I would be heading, but using a kind of framework that I've talked about and giving teachers the kinds of questions in that research to be just thinking about when they're watching children. However, once you're into kind of upper key stage 1, key stage 2, then a well-being check like this, we have seen lots of children use this already. Very young children can use this. They're, scarily data literate compared to, IT literate, and sort of understand, these devices far better than I did when I was that age. Well, it didn't exist, I think. But you've got this way of, finding out in a kind of soft way, I think, with the younger children would be my suggestion.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. And we've got another question here, which is perhaps about taking a more whole school approach to wellbeing. So how can we get management to understand that wellbeing of staff has an impact on the wellbeing of the children and the general wellbeing of the whole school? Quite a tricky question, that one.
It's an interesting one. Yeah, I'm obviously not knowing anything about those, specific conditions in that school. I would hope that anybody who was in a leadership role would understand that if their staff aren't well motivated and well cared for, well supported, then you're kind of going nowhere as a team. So I would maybe think if there is a real problem here in this particular situation, then I think just very diplomatically, very sort of gently, you raise these issues and just say, do you realize, there is, a general feeling, some of the staff are feeling really quite under pressure and, maybe not quite confident or, feeling well enough supported to do what they need to do. Again, we are thinking, I know our product people are talking about a wellbeing product for staff, but that's a little way off. But again, I would refer you back to that Anna Freud site, perhaps, because there is that, I think, number 4 on the list. I'm just going to backtrack through the slides here. And there you get, sorry, beg your pardon, it's number 5 on that, the orange circle. They will give you a little bit of advice there about supporting staff. Because I think that is, vastly overlooked and a really, really good question there. So thank you very, very much for that. But I would say, build your case, explain what the situation is if you're concerned with the leadership and management team. And I'm sure in most cases they will want to help and want to respond. but there might be some advice for you there on that website.
Great, thank you. We have another, I'm going to say another tricky question here, but we'll give it a go. So what is your opinion about students who maybe have particular medical conditions or, present things like forgetfulness, and how can we perhaps adapt teaching within a whole class setting to look after everyone?
Again, I'm just trying to think how I did that. I mean, the move over the last few years, obviously I can only talk about the UK in terms of my own personal experience, but we had a system when I joined in the sort of late 90s where children were segregated, into, there was mainstream and there were special educational units in schools, and they disappeared on the whole. There's not many of them around, and children were the expectation was that most children would go into mainstream unless there was a really good reason for doing or for not doing so. So I had a vast range, I suppose, of students who were all points on the ability scale and sort of the behavioral and emotional spectrum as well. And I think it's a case of getting to know your students and finding out what the specifics are, because again, if it is something like forgetfulness, that is it forgetfulness, or are they just not understanding what they need to do in the first place? So I think you need to kind of dig a little bit more deeply there. But I used to have little cards or laminated, where you can sometimes cover them in plastic, and they were on the table, and I had, depending on which year group I was teaching at the time, now they could be something as simple as, whenever you start to write a sentence, use a capital letter. I'm just plucking examples out of the air here. Always have, the full stop at the end. Really, really basic things which you can't believe you've got to remember. You remind children about again and again and again. So suppose visual prompts, wall displays. Having things on your classroom walls. The wall displays I had weren't just about, here's a piece of work that the children have done. It was maybe an example of, this is how you set out a particular piece of writing, or maths, where we have kind of number squares or number facts, or these things that are just really blatantly put on display on the wall or on the child's desk. You can put on with, stick what we called, was it backing plastic, or things where you can stick things to children's desks, like an aid memoir, a prompt. And then, of course, if you're fortunate enough to be able to have that additional adult support, it's a question of how do you deploy the adult support in the room. I used to set up groups and have there were 5 working days of the week, so typically I had my children split into kind of 5 groups, and certainly in maths and in literacy, I would make sure that I worked directly for at least part of the literacy lesson that day with each group. So I'd rotate around. So on a Monday, I'd work with group 1. On a Tuesday, I'd work with group 2. On a Wednesday, I'd work with group 3, and so on, for a kind of focused part of the lesson, not the whole lesson. You do your whole class teaching, you set the children their tasks, and then you go and join one of the groups. And you can do that according to ability. So you can be, not every day, this isn't going to work in every single lesson, but at least for some part of the week, children are going to get direct support and intervention. And of course, you need to be looking at that work. What are the children producing? The work in their books or on paper or on their slates or tablets or computers or whatever they're using these days. We had small plastic whiteboards that children wrote responses on. And it's looking at that, it's monitoring it, it's working out what the issue is. And then you as a teacher, that's your job to kind of then think about the plan, the solution. But again, some really nice websites out there with some nice advice. Bit of a lengthy answer that, but quite an interesting question.
No, that's great, thank you. And I think we've maybe got time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. So we've got a question here, which you sort of touched on slightly in the presentation, but I think it's around baseline assessments. And what would your thoughts be on either encouraging students to take some sort of wellbeing check before they join the school, or perhaps at the very start of the year, and using that as a basis? This is from Colliam.
Well, that's a great question. So I think, yes, I would advise, again, it's why do we assess anything? It goes back to that slide. You are gathering information. So if you can gather information, as much information as possible at as early a stage as possible, that's what I would recommend. I'm not sure if psychological evaluation, I think that's got a fairly specific meaning, and I will leave that to the psychologists to answer that. But I'm just talking about kind of gathering a very general profile, what students and young people think about their learning. And that's a really valuable thing to do. And you're absolutely right there. I believe some behaviors may be beyond a class teacher to handle. You're dead right. Full agreement there. And that's why this is where school leaders come in. You cannot just expect that teachers will just routinely deal with all of this. You need to be supporting your staff as a school leader. I wouldn't have dreamt of just leaving my teachers to get on with it. It's a conversation. Again, it's like a lot of these things. We ask the questions, we find out some information that may actually be quite sort of uncomfortable to deal with, and we think about how, in a sensitive, confidential, constructive way, do we do this? That website that I mentioned, it's got some really good advice. The Anna Freud Center, because teachers are not experts in handling well-being. There is a trend, and I think there is a tendency to allow teachers to become almost, kind of parapsychologists and paramedics in some ways, in terms of dealing with increasingly complicated problems. So it's flagging the issue with your leaders. It's trying to do the best you can to find out those sorts of hints and tips that you need. But if you need support, you've got to ask for it, and you've got to just sort of think, just in a very upfront way. It's a case of, if you're not telling anybody about it further up the management chain, they're never going to do anything about it. So it's in a diplomatic and professional way, identifying the problem and setting out a clear request, and then looking around for help and advice. And again, it would be interesting to talk more about that in another webinar perhaps, but we can also just point you to the sources of information that I've mentioned today. When you get the slides, follow the links, have a look.
Great, thank you. So I think that is all of the questions that we've had through. I'll just have a look. Yeah. So thank you everyone so much for attending today. If there's anything further that you'd like to know, please do pop it in the chat box or at the survey at the end of the webinar, and we'd be more than happy to follow up with you afterwards and start a conversation there. But just say thank you to Mark Fraser for his presentation today. It was some really interesting topics that we covered. And like I say, if you'd like to get in touch with us about how Chem can support your school, please don't hesitate to get in touch. You can contact us at chem@cambridge.org, and all of our contact details are available on our website. We have a few more webinars happening in the coming weeks and months. We're continuing to look at our various assessment products, as well as some regionally focused webinars. So we're taking a look at why international schools in your region might choose to use Cambridge Chem. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you so much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day.